Yeah, so I sort of want to start this quick conversation, and I also beat Stephanie. I have 6 slides. I was told 3. Classic academic mistake, right? So I wanted to start because I think my challenge currently as a quote unquote academic is kind of embedded in the idea or the reality that I worked in the private sector as a land use planner in land development before going into a PhD program. And I went into that PhD program with the idea that I would get the skills that maybe would help us tackle things systematically as planners. And in many ways, academics aren't necessarily set up for that type of practical work. And I distinctly remember my first class where I was making a sort of planner's argument about why we should do things. And my advisor said, "Who cares?" Right? And I was like, "Oh, this is going to be tough." And her point wasn't that who cares. Her point was that you were just describing something and not really explaining why it is, and maybe thinking about it from a systematic perspective. And so I've tried to take this sort of practical background that I have as a planner, apply some of the geographic and analytical skills that I've gained, and use those at the micro level, understanding the context within which vacant and abandoned properties tend to happen, not necessarily zombies. Zombies are an offshoot of a larger systematic problem, and so trying to get our heads around that a little bit. So maybe some of my discontent in the planning profession was we were just describing things and I was just applying sort of Band-Aids to it, right? We can find a case of a single house that's vacant and abandoned. We need to do demolition and solve that problem in an expedient manner. But what we really, I think, need to get to from a practical perspective and an analytical perspective and a policy perspective is to maybe explain how that process is unfolded over time, so that we can apply what I think are context-sensitive policies at the micro level that really understand where it is that we're actually working. And so trying to take that approach, we took that, and myself and my colleague who said yesterday no one else would say modifiable aerial unit problem, and so I just did, and I just one-upped him. We worked on this project in the city of Tonawanda, which I want to use to sort of get ourselves around this sort of spatial thinking idea. But when I teach my students planning, I've sort of adopted this idea of systems thinking and trying to impart it in the classroom to get students to understand that what we see on the ground, the things that we can easily describe, these events or conditions, are great. We need to do that. But if we don't understand the things that are beneath that, we've heard the term tip of the iceberg many times, this is where that comes into place. If we don't understand the underlying structures that guide the tip of that iceberg and create that condition that we tend to see, then we have a real hard problem actually identifying an adequate solution to solve the problem. We can apply the Band-Aid to it, which is we can go in and demolish one house, but we're not going to ensure that more houses like that don't appear on the landscape. And I think that's a different conversation altogether. So we can, planners are really good at describing things in current space or current time, and maybe that pattern in space and time together. But understanding what the structural components are that drive those conditions, I think, is critically important. And I think most people in here recognize this sort of systems thinking. If they're not doing it explicitly, at least understand it implicitly. Part of the challenge we had, and was mentioned in a few conversations yesterday, was the mental models that really drive how we make policy are centered around economic development first and sort of free market policy and things like that, that in many ways don't solve our problems at the neighborhood scale, and it becomes somewhat of a challenge. And so in the city of Tonawanda, which is actually my hometown, the community I live in, we felt like the flexibility that was inherent in that very first round of zombie grants allowed the city to take a different approach to addressing zombies in their community, which was rather than a lot of communities went out and they took that money and they hired legal firms to go out and chase down those homeowners or those property owners. Being from Tonawanda and sort of being my hometown and the way I was thinking at the time, and the grant I think set up for this, we said, well, listen, let's try to really understand where your market sits in the broader market, right? And then once we understand that, what's happening at the sort of municipal level in your individual neighborhood, so that when we think about how we apply strategies around around zombies, we're also addressing vacancy and abandonment, which I think we are a little bit sort of ahead of the curve there, because the second round really sort of interjects this idea of vacancy or vacant and abandoned. And we were thinking about that sort of preliminary to round two. So we essentially looked at all of the housing data we could get our hands on in the county, and then tried to understand where the city of Tonawonda's position was in this broader housing market. Our challenge in Western New York is actually is somewhat interesting because we have this massively fragmented region, right? We have 44 municipalities in 2 counties. We also have a very flat population change. So as communities empty out, particularly older first-ring suburbs communities empty out like City of Tonawanda, it's really hard for those communities to backfill what other regions have, which is maybe some new household formation. We don't really have that. So it's really, really hard to backfill those projects. So those houses. So we really wanted to help the city really understand what was happening and where they were positioned regionally. And, it was mentioned yesterday, one of the things we find it's quite obvious is, school quality matters. It's a major predictor in both housing preferences for families with children, but also people that want to move in neighborhoods that they may have children down the road. And then the other thing we found was, neighborhoods that are dense and walkable tend to have a sort of higher preference from the market as well. Tonawanda doesn't really have any of those things. Sort of, it's in the middle. So it's hard to come up with policy at the neighborhood level for them. But here's I sort of think the systems thinking component when we went to the city and said, well, here's one way to think about what's happening in your community. We looked at building permits, and so those were discussed earlier, and code violations, and we sort of explained to the community those are really 2 different stocks of money flowing in and out of your community. Code violations are, we argue, a sign of disinvestment, right? Anybody knows this, that as we see roofs deteriorate, windows get broken, front porches start to sag, foundations start to crack, that is a sign of disinvestment and value going out of that neighborhood or that block. And the opposite is true. When we see people pull code or building permits for additions and new roofs and new kitchens and those types of things, it tends to show that people are willing to reinvest in that place. So you tell a community, listen, you have sort of broader challenges, but when we look at the micro level, you might want to think about where you want to look at working in your community strategically. The communities on the left are the places that have a large number of code violations, right? Signs of disinvestment. And the challenge that they have, and this is where getting them to think about policy in the first round and then policy in the second round is, when you look at that in sort of as a quantity, the value of disinvestment is outpacing the value of reinvestment. And that is in some ways predictive of future problems as we move ahead in the city of Tonawanda, as population and households decrease over time. So the hope is that eventually that sort of get them to understand that they can maybe stem the tide here a little bit, thinking systematically. But the bigger challenge, and this is the other issue, when I went to the city and I tried to work with councils and mayor's offices directly, and the approach I tend to take with them, and I did this with the city of Tonawanda, is I tell them what the data is telling us. So I'm sort of leading them a little bit, right? I say, well, you've got these challenges, right? You have this, you have this substantial disinvestment in your community, and you have these limitations in City Hall as it relates to technical and fiscal capacity. And they go, yeah, that's a problem. And then I say, well, do you want to change that? And they say, yeah, of course. And then I say, can we get there with business as usual? And then their eyes get big. And then you sort of go, well, we have to get off this horse. We have to change and rethink the way we attack this problem. We can't continue to ride this dead horse over and over and over again. And I will say that this is not a criticism of government. It's a criticism of most industries and bureaucracies and institutions. Academics is classic for this. I get told all the time, we have always done it this way. And I always find that that's not an acceptable answer to me. And so my point to the city of Tonawanda was, instead of buying a stronger whip or changing riders, it's actually time to get off that horse and find a new horse. So that's it. Thank you.
So code enforcement has been coming up again and again. And Carrie White, not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot a minute, if you don't mind coming up, sort of our special guest for a couple of minutes to just talk a little bit. I mean, all of this work around making the zombie grants, supporting the land banks, a lot of it has really been about how do you more effectively and strategically use code enforcement to bring up the quality of your housing. And we're hearing about all the challenges and all the issues around that, but there's also, I think in some ways, some good news on the horizon in that this issue is really now on the radar of the legislature and the governor, and so I'll let you do the talking about that.
Great. Thanks, Helene. I do think it is important to take a moment and think about possibilities for code enforcement. Obviously, as the Attorney General's office has been working on this issue for a few years, thanks to Dina, who really spearheaded that charge through some of the settlement funds, doing some of the work with the land banks and zombies, but realizing that that work was insufficient if cities' codes offices weren't adequately resourced to find the vacant properties, to be able to categorize and find out where there's violations and where the work should be focused. And I think, as Helene mentioned, now there's some momentum around figuring out how, as a state, we should be more invested in code enforcement. Many of you probably know that a couple of state senators, Senator Skoufis and Biaggi, led an investigation and came up with a report last year about code enforcement and some of the inadequacies and where there are issues in certain cities. And I think one of the things I appreciated from their report was that, the biggest issue they found was that there's not enough resources for code enforcement, and the state provides no resources really for code enforcement, and particularly around, supporting the code officers with having staff, but also around what kind of training do code enforcement officers have? Should that be standardized? Should we be looking at how our code enforcement offices should be learning from each other. So I think that was really important. I think there are a few pieces that I also found lacking from that report, particularly around equity and what are also the repercussions of increased enforcement, particularly in marginalized neighborhoods. This is something that the office has really worked on through some of our programs, particularly the Cities Rise program, which there are several folks from cities that are part of the Cities Rise program. And a key component of that program was, how does equity interplay with code enforcement? So what are the impacts on communities when you, as code enforcement officers, are making decisions? And I think that we, as we go into the next legislative session, I do think these senators who've kind of revealed some of these issues are going to want to push some code enforcement initiatives, which is great, but I think we should also be thinking about and sharing what we've learned from our interactions with communities, and to make sure the legislature is contemplating that as well, because we also know that just increasing fines and increasing enforcement might actually have a detrimental impact on the communities you're trying to lift up. And we all know from being on the ground, from the folks you all know from the work you do on the ground, that there's a lot more than just, landlords or investment companies who don't care about housing. There's a lot of people in their communities who do care about their housing and would love to improve their housing, but because of economics and because of other issues, struggle to do that. So I appreciate Helene calling me up. I did want to just take a minute to kind of put that thought in everyone's brain as we're moving into the legislative session, if this is coming up, that we should really be sharing these stories and sharing some of the best practices. Since we have Syracuse represented up here with Stephanie and I were talking about yesterday the really great engagement initiative that Syracuse took on of doing kitchen table talks, where members from the Syracuse Code and other city departments went into members of their community's kitchens to talk about what were the issues that they're seeing, how are they dealing with codes, what are the issues they're seeing in their communities, and really, trying to reach out to communities and populations that don't often engage with the city to try to open that line of communication. So I think, we all recognize there's a need to improve the deteriorating housing stock. The codes department can be a huge ally in that fight, but they can be an ally beyond just being enforcement. They can be an ally by being a connection to the community. They can be an ally by connecting folks who are living in a deficient household to resources that can help them improve their living condition. And so there's a much broader way which code enforcement can champion the safety of their neighborhoods, and we should be trying to expand that rather than trying to focus on only ticketing and enforcement and fines and penalties.
Stephanie, sorry, we don't have time. Stephanie, on your blight busting, what type of things do you actually do? Like what above and beyond, removing garbage and mowing lawns? What are the conditions that you look to remediate in that process? And I'm assuming that's summarily, right, without going to court?
Correct. Yes. We use the exterior violations that the enforcement officer cited, like porch handrails, broken steps, soffit fascia, broken garage door. We've replaced porches. Porches are a big one that changed the perception of blight. And they're expensive and they get people's attention. Our lowest blight busting, I think, was $3,500 and our biggest was $21,000.
So Stephanie, could you tell us a little more about how the blight busting program works? Because it started as a way to enforce the zombie law, right? And so you've had banks step up and do some of the work under threat of having the city do it? You want to talk just a little bit about how that has played out?
Sure. So we try to send several letters before we execute our contract with the contractor, because once we do that, we're legally obligated to pay somebody to do what we need to have done. And what we find is we'll also issue often new, very specific violations. So instead of it just saying, the soffit needs painting, it will say the left, it'll be very specific. And we're finding that those specific violations get people nervous and correct those violations. But the threat of blight busting has gotten a lot of folks in, whether it's sort of just tax current properties to get them back into productive use. But I will tell you, we had one that we started the work and it was 75% done. And then the crew showed up on a Friday and the lady who owned the property had her crew there. So it's not perfect, but certainly, I should have mentioned earlier also we did an RFQ for construction firms and we only solicited MWBEs for that. And that's been working really well also just to build capacity. These are jobs where there's no homeowner, nobody's home, you can go when you need to. And we also have no cost permitting, so that we're just looking to sort of surgically get in there, get the job done, do it well, and get out. Is that?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, hi, this is Marlon Molina from City of Mount Vernon. So did you say you set aside $500,000 or $5 million for demolitions? Because there was a lot of demolitions for that amount of money. We demolished 2 homes in the past 2 years, and one was about $40,000, the other one was $70,000.
How big was that house?
It's an upstate, downstate problem.
Yeah.
Downstate, it costs us $50,000, and upstate, you can do it for 20. And if anyone has the answer to that, I think both of us would love to know how you're doing it.
And then the other question was, so we are a Zombie 1.0 grantee as well as the City's Rise, and we just went through the process. Hi. We just went through the process of figuring out how you build capacity. You end up with more code enforcement violations, and then you have the legal process. So you have to build that up. And I think that he kind of asked the question, but did the city have to spend more resources to do the legal enforcement in the courts? I think you kind of answered it, but you answered the part of going the option of just doing the letter and alerting the homeowner about the code violation. But how much more legal resources do you have to invest into doing some of the work that you did?
Well, just the first question, it's 500,000 that we allocate every year. I wish we had $5 million a year to address this, but I will say that's just in the city's budget. Then we allocate some of our CDBG. You know, we work with our nonprofit partners. They secure other resources. So there's lots of demolition going on outside of the cities. Our money is the ones we either court order or declare an emergency. So they're city-created demolitions that we fund. On the other side, on enforcement, I didn't really talk about our Bureau of Administrative Adjudication, but we started a BAA, or ticketing for codes, is the shorthand, about a year ago, and it's been incredibly helpful to alleviate our legal team, who was using very limited slots on the State Supreme and the City Housing Court docket. We're reserving those slots for really severe cases, or an owner that owns multiple properties, and that we're trying to really get ticketing off the ground to address sort of these more singular, quick issues. And we also had legislation to be able to put the fines from ticketing on the taxes. So all of that stuff is part of enforcement. We are fortunate to also be Zombie 2.0 recipient, and right now our legal team, we have 1.75 FTEs working on thousands of violations. So, and they have other stuff to do. So if you have a caseload where you have, no smoke detector in an occupied 10-unit building, or a zombie that Stephanie's saying, can you please put this one forward? I mean, obviously occupied properties are always going to take precedent with our legal process. So we're going to be hiring an attorney very soon just to work on vacants, so they can be very singularly focused and gather that expertise to use the state legislation more effectively in our community. Did that answer your question?
Hi, Tolga Morawski, Greater Mohawk Valley Land Bank. I have two quick questions. One for Ms. Pasquale. With Wade and I have been working on something for summary abatement, and I'm very curious, do you re-levy those fees? And then I'll just ask my second question and sit down and let you guys answer. But Mr. Knight, I'm really curious, with the municipalities and the riding the dead horse analogy, one of the things that we've experienced in our catchment area, we have a lot of different communities, and there's this tendency for a lack of capacity, not only in the employees, but also the boards. And one of the ways that manifests itself is just that mentality, where we have boards that are, cumulatively, they've been in office for 100 years. So how are some of the ways that you tried to overcome that? Thank you.
I'm so sorry. I forgot what my question was. I was so interested in that question.
I'll forget too, don't worry.
Sorry. With the summary abatement, if the homeowner doesn't pay, have you been re-levying it? Because that's been something we've been trying to figure.
Yeah, so May 15th is our day. When we send out the bill, if you don't pay, we try to collect on it through, we have a person who handles billing just for vacants. And I think if you don't pay by May 15th, it gets on the taxes.
So it's an interesting question. I think, one of the challenges you have with particularly small suburban communities or even rural communities is that complete lack of technical capacity in this arena. And I think the emergence of population loss and vacants and abandoned properties in the suburbs is something that they struggle to tackle. In the city of Tonawanda, what we sort of were able to convince them is that they needed to do something. Now that always results in them sort of putting their hand out, right? Because they don't have the fiscal or the technical capacity to do that. And in some cases, grants can help fill that void. So the Zombie grant, rounds 1 and 2 for Tonawanda, we initiated some GIS capacity in the city, got them some licensing, allowed them to buy some points, to do some data field work, to collect some data and sort of think about maybe one way to strategize around the use of technology. It's a community that, thinking about this challenge, it's a community that their code enforcement system internally is antiquated. They write a sort of 30-day notice letter. The code enforcement person drops that letter in a secretary's inbox, sort of a draft. They print that out and redrop it in his inbox to sign, then it goes back into her inbox to mail out. And so they have very limited code enforcement capacity. And I said, well, one of the ways we could maybe increase some capacity for the code enforcement officer to do his work is maybe streamline that process a little bit, right? So it is a huge challenge, and it requires, I think, outside outside funding and a lot of training.
This kind of goes back to what I was talking about yesterday, where a lot of the grant funds don't necessarily go to the places where they're most needed. And what Jason's talking about, some of the examples of why it's hard to actually effectively even use funds. And so I think that's something we really need to think about globally in New York State. And speaking to HUD, the HCR, Attorney General's office, all of us, when we're structuring grants, when we're thinking about how they're going to work, are we really providing the support for the grantees to use these funds effectively? And as many people have described, it isn't just, oh, maybe we don't have enough code enforcement officers. It's and Dina, I know you really championed this early on, the technology, but also just training and resources, really thinking about how are we more effective at doing that, at really helping the municipalities, the smaller ones, the ones in more cash-strapped communities to do this work.
Hi, I'm Christine from Watertown. I want to say I'm very impressed with Stephanie, with Syracuse, of what they have done with the initiative on the vacant homes. I've been doing it since last October, and I'm the only one. There's not 6 of me, so I've got a lot of work ahead of me, and I'm really interested in that blight busting. You don't have to have a warrant to go onto the property, because normally we have to have a warrant to exercise, because otherwise, we're trespassing. And I want to know, like, when you send out your violation letters, and they're explicit, as you say, because we have to have them explicit, because if they go to legal, we have to say, yeah, it was the right side soffit, it was the back door. How many letters do you send out, and how much time do you give them also to get these violations into compliance? And also, in the end, when you do put things, out to billing for the property owners that they haven't done it, and you say you re-levy it, have you seen a good turnaround in monies coming back that you've invested?
Sure. So each violation, typically exterior ones, you have 30 days. There's not a health and safety typically issue. If there's a structural issue, then that's a different story. But for the blight busting, it's typically 30 days. Obviously, if we cite you October 31, and you don't get it done, we'll be flexible. Most of it is just communication. The properties that have gone through are just no communication, nothing. And those are the ones where we know no matter how many times we send a letter, they're not going to do the work. So our legal team hasn't said anything to us yet about not having a warrant. We've been cutting lawns, and addressing overgrowth forever. I know this is, altering the actual structure, but so far we have not been challenged. And about half have paid. So I don't know if that answers your question. And then the other half are pretty new, so they're in that payment cycle. They haven't gone on the taxes yet. Any questions? Or even would love to hear about what you're doing in your communities, whether you're a land bank or municipality, how you're addressing some of these vacant house challenges and shortage of affordable housing challenges more generally. And whether you've made some progress linking the disconnect between the vacants and the need for affordable housing.
So CDBG funds, I know there's not enough of them, but they can be used for similar essential repairs on tax foreclosed properties by municipalities.
Yes, so 2 things I think to keep in mind with CDBG. One, the challenge to CDBG for blight busting is you can only use a small percentage of the funds for slums and blight, what we call the national objective of slums and blight. So you're limited by dollar amount to less than about 30% of the grant. So that just because the grants are small, that means there's not enough money. The way you can use CDBG is for post-development. So some folks are using it for property management, to board and mow, just to keep properties in a neighborhood in an eligible way. We call it low mod area eligibility. So you can use that outside of the blight piece on your 70% of your money. and then post-development. So if you're doing a tear down, you could use the demo, but you could use CDBG for the rehab side if you could put somebody in the building. And so I think that's the better use of CDBG. There's some real limitations about just fiscal limitations about how much you can tear down. So, I think we're seeing more and more cities take a full 30% of their annual allocation just to get some demo done. But it's not nearly enough. It's certainly used in partnership with, the zombie money and some of the other demo resources from local governments.
But just to clarify, so if some communities that don't have a land bank, if they were to take in some property through the tax foreclosure process, and if they were to use CDBG funds to do some essential repairs, which is an element, does that then trigger who's going to purchase? Or if it's just essential repairs, can they then sell it to a purchaser that doesn't meet 80% AMI?
For the CDBG walks, the answer is both ways. It depends on how you categorize it, right? So if it's in an area where you are doing low mod work in a low mod defined area, or you have targeted a low mod income buyer, you could use CDBG as low mod. If you are just doing property stabilization in an area that is part of the slums and blight plan to reduce and eliminate slums and blight, you could use that 30% caveat to meet your national objective. So the answer is both. It really depends on the property occupancy and plan in that neighborhood. So call your friendly HUD rep, and we'll help you design it so you stay clean and compliant.
This might be a quick one. For anyone in the room or the panelists, for those of us who are working in rural communities, this might piggyback off of you. If anyone has any idea about how to utilize USDA resources in order to fight blight in rural areas, I'm not familiar with any, but I wonder if there's any in the room, because I know HUD might not be our first thing to hop on, and we're not as familiar with HUD resources in rural areas. But if you've used USDA in some way, whether it's low-income housing or something that's helped fight blight, we'd love to hear that, because we want to help too. So thank you. I don't know if the panelists can help or anything.
We don't actually do much interweaving with our subsidy and USDA subsidy. Can I just ask you a question back? When you're talking about relieving blight in rural communities, do you mean single-family vacant properties? I mean it all. Yeah, no, so I mean, USDA obviously has a lot of first-time home ownership, lending opportunities, right? And some, frankly, sometimes they're easier to work with than SUNY May. Specifically for first-time home buyers. So I would say, I would look to USDA for filling vacants with new homeowners, right? That would be sort of like the linkage. I'm not sure USDA provides any resources for the purposes of demolition or enforcement or what Stephanie is talking about. So, sorry.
And I don't know if they still have it, but USDA, maybe if there's somebody from a rural county, they used to have a program called the Housing Preservation Grants. I don't know if those are still in place. But the housing preservation grants would allow for some rehab, and we've seen that combined with home funds. So you can get home funds in rural counties through the competitive process with HCR and match them up. And a big use on that was faulty water and sewer systems. So in rural areas where people were reliant on wells and septic, that was not passing code and prohibiting occupancy. That was a good match.
It's been years since I've looked at it, but on the community development side of rural development, they had a community facilities grant, which I think allowed them to, if there was a property or something that a nonprofit or a community could revitalize and then turn over to, a for-profit entity or something, in order to sort of upgrade a downtown, a rural downtown area. So that might be another way. It's not necessarily on the housing side, but on the community development side of USDA.
So I was just wondering about the panelists' thought about the future of funding. So there's still some areas that are not covered, a lot of work still to do, and the infrastructure that we've also created. Wondering about, do we feel optimistic about funding? to support this work, or not so much?
So, you know, it's a good point, Kevin, right? Because we're in our now, I think, closing in on the third year of the governor's big investment through the housing plan. So, right, $20 billion. And, you know, that has sort of taken up a lot of time, and there's a lot of units to like finish doing. And so, but I do think it is not too early to start thinking about what the next phase of that kind of investment is going to be, recognizing that it only got us so far, right? And that there are areas that maybe weren't fully addressed in the first round of the housing plan. So I would say, you know, I do think there's going to be probably a renewed commitment to housing coming from the state. I can't speak for the feds, but can't really speak for the state either. But I would say that like our general consensus is that there is an acknowledgement that these dollars were really well spent, that it only gets you so far, and that there's going to have to be future like similar really big time investment to keep these things going. So I am optimistic. I also would just say two more things. One is that I'm starting to feel more optimistic that the philanthropic world is starting to turn its attention very directly to housing in a way that has not been true in my at least 20 years doing this. And that's encouraging. I worry a little bit for the reasons Carrie sort of described, that you don't want that to be too far away from the grassroots, so that you don't want those decisions made in a boardroom. Right? You want them to be informed by what's happening on the ground, and also sort of your point. And so I think it's probably a good time for the affordable housing community writ large to be engaging with the philanthropic folks. You know, Wells Fargo just committed, what's the number, $100 billion to make up for some past deeds. So, you know, that's a huge opportunity, but I think it's important that those decisions don't get made separate and apart from the practitioners who are on the ground doing the work.
And what I would add to that, and a consortium of the very big foundations are doing this now, is operating support. Huge issue. If you can't keep the lights on for the nonprofits, it's really hard to do the programmatic work. And so, and really looking at what it costs to actually administer a program. And there should never be a program that's around vacants and these housing issues that doesn't have a significant operating support component. I know we all need to show our funders and show our legislators and everyone else, well, we have 10 widgets. We did 10 houses or 20 houses or whatever the case may be. But that can be short-sighted because you're not building capacity that way. So just my own 2 cents.
I would support more additional operating support too on behalf of all New York State land banks. This is more of a comment, but our dead horse from a land bank perspective is this cost of demolition, because the reality that we're facing on the land bank side, which is largely a more reactive side right now to deal with what we have, is that cost. And I don't want to get into all the nuances, but to say that we have a lot of thought leaders here and some academic support. We would be interested, the New York State Land Bank Association, to collaborate with maybe doing a deeper dive on ways to dial down those costs. And the Albany County Land Bank's approaching its 100th demolition in just 4 years, and our average demolition cost is about $35,000 combined for usually a 2-family wood-framed or brick structure with a range of $17,000 to $85,000 for demolition. So a lot of funders in the room, and if we're thinking of limited resources and very few people are even willing to fund demolitions with no affordable housing coming behind it, I think it would be I think a lot of folks here would like to see or contribute to ways of bringing down those costs statewide, not just for land banks, but for anyone doing this work. So I guess I won't be here for the brainstorming lightning session, but I would want to set forth the idea of like, this should be maybe something we consider as a group, and I would be willing to collaborate with people on what can we do outside the box creatively, or look at best practices beyond just procurement to drive that down, because I think it would benefit all of us by freeing up more of these limited resources.
My comments piggyback on that from the development side. I'm also wondering if we can get our resources together as we develop. I'm with Habitat, so we take a house that we now want to flip, and we take it forward, we're buffeted by some costs that are hard to control that we could use a lot of help on legislatively, such as ladder law, the thought of having to put sprinklers in the house someday. That's going to be a fairly significant cost if it comes online. And do we have that kind of muscle to help in the advocacy work so we can keep the cost down on the development side so we can put more houses online? I don't know who could answer that, but.
The Scaffold Law.
New York State's the only law, the only state that still has this law in effect. So on a construction site, if somebody's hurt by gravity, the developer is automatically wrong. So the Salino and Barnes or those attorneys that do the claims automatically win. So it's very hard to get insurance in New York State if you're a developer. I think there's only one insurer left in the state. So it's hard to insure your work sites because of this very outdated law. Very outdated and very expensive.
I'm just going to mention, since it came up, that if anybody's interested in the scaffold law, some of our colleagues have done a lot of research on that and published some work at Cornell here. It is Richard Geddes, myself, and somebody else.
Who will apparently remain unnamed.
Michael Hatter, but he's not here anymore.
So I'd love to talk with you about that because when I work for the Center for Community Progress. So I remember when we look at demolitions across the country, it's 5,000 to 11,000. And so we had a law professor at Albany Law try to look into this, and the only thing he could trace it back to was this absolute indemnification, that we're the only state left. And it would be really interesting to figure out if that's the case. If it is, I know scaffolding law gets into a whole political mess, but it's just passed a law that says demolitions on single, two-family, three-unit buildings are exempted, period. Like, let's not get into the political fight, but let's dramatically see if we can reduce our demolition cost by creating an exemption since we're committing so much money to these demolitions.
But Tarek, what about all that asbestos? That's a little issue too, I hear.
Well, and that you can't test for the asbestos. Once you condemn it, you can't test, and then you need to take it down. So I think that's always been an issue with us.
We have a real shortage of facilities where you can dump asbestos-containing material in New York State. So the tipping fees are going up every year significantly, and we're having fewer and fewer facilities that will accept asbestos-containing material, and I think that's a big cost driver for us in New York State.
Just an anecdote to emphasize this cost of demolition. We actually, the stars all aligned. We had a building that the city was saying, take this down, take this down. We had a nonprofit that wanted to develop it. We convinced the city to let us in and estimate the cost. They had found the bank that held the zombie mortgage. And we got together and we said, okay, you're going to have to demolish this. It's going to cost you, so just give us the money in the building. And they said, okay, what's it going to cost? And we knew it would cost like 45 or 50, so we said 75. They didn't bulk. They gave us $75,000 and the building and $8,000 for liens. Now, it's a complete fluke. I don't know how to repeat this. I don't know how to just line these stars up.
Replicable.
But they really believed $75,000. And frankly, it's going to take $35,000 just to get the asbestos off the roof. So maybe they knew that.
Thanks, Barb. That's in Troy, right? Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you for all the questions and comments from the audience. And we'll,
Thanks.